Lena Miller had always been the epitome of precision and elegance, a seasoned flight attendant for over 12 years. Her job with Sky Elite Airlines was her pride, and she'd mastered the art of handling the elite, first-class travelers who expected nothing but perfection. But as the passengers boarded Flight 228 to New York, Lena's sharp eyes zeroed in on the Sanders family. Their modest attire and quiet demeanor didn't match the typical high-flyers she was accustomed to. Something about them felt off, yet their first-class boarding passes were as valid as anyone else's. What secret lay beneath their unassuming exterior? Comment below to let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Lena Miller had always prided herself on her impeccable service. A flight attendant for over 12 years, she knew the ins and outs of the luxury air travel industry like the back of her hand. Working for Sky Elite Airlines, Lena was no stranger to the demands of high-profile passengers who expected nothing short of perfection. With every flight, she maintained a sense of authority, knowing her role was critical in ensuring a seamless experience for the elite few who booked first-class tickets. As passengers boarded Flight 228 to New York, Lena scanned the crowd, her sharp eyes assessing every individual as they approached the gate. It was second nature to her, a quick calculation of who might need special attention and who would fit the mold of a quiet, pleasant traveler. Sky Elite's first-class cabins were reserved for the cream of the crop, and Lena took pride in managing these expectations flawlessly. But as the Sanders family approached, Lena's instincts shifted. James Sanders, a man in his mid-30s with a calm yet assertive presence, walked ahead of his wife, Elena, and their two young children. The Sanders family wasn't ostentatious, but there was something about them that caught Lena's attention. James wore a crisp navy blue blazer that looked smart, but modest. Elena's outfit was understated yet elegant, a simple dress and a pair of sunglasses perched atop her head. Their children were well-behaved, quietly following behind them. Lena glanced at their boarding passes, noting they were valid for first class. Yet something gnawed at her, an unexplainable discomfort. The Sanders didn't fit the profile of a typical first-class passenger. In Lena's mind, they were an anomaly, polite, composed, but lacking the distinct air of wealth and privilege that made other passengers seem to belong. Her unease quickly escalated. What were they doing here? She thought, eyeing their calm demeanor. Lena couldn't quite shake the feeling that the family didn't belong in a space she had always considered exclusive. Before they reached the gate, Lena called out to them, asking them to step aside for a moment. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his voice even, but with a hint of confusion in his eyes. Lena hesitated, but her resolve hardened. It wasn't right, she thought. "I just need to confirm your reservation," she said, giving a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Despite the obvious validity of their tickets, Lena's suspicion was overpowering. Lena Miller had built a reputation in the airline industry that was second to none. With over a decade of experience as a flight attendant for Sky Elite Airlines, she had mastered the art of providing exceptional service to the affluent passengers who booked first-class tickets. The luxurious cabins, the polished amenities, the personalized attention, Lena ensured everything ran with precision. To her, this was more than just a job, it was a lifestyle. She prided herself on her ability to remain composed and professional no matter the situation. She had faced difficult passengers before, demanding requests, complaints about the food, and even the occasional tantrum. But Lena had learned how to manage it all with grace and poise. She was known for her calm demeanor, her efficiency, and most of all, her ability to anticipate the needs of the elite few who were fortunate enough to book Sky Elite's first-class seats. Lena's approach was always calculated. She knew the importance of making passengers feel special, like royalty, and that was what kept them coming back. She'd been praised by her supervisors for maintaining high standards, and she wore the acknowledgement like a badge of honor. It wasn't just about delivering a perfect flight experience, it was about making each passenger feel as if they were the only one on board. As the passengers boarded, Lena stood tall at the front of the gate, her posture straight and her expression serene. She watched carefully as each person approached. For her, it was about assessing, quickly judging who required extra attention, who might ask for something outside the norm, and who might complain or need special handling. It had become second nature to her, a finely honed skill developed over years of working in high-pressure, high-expectation environments. The Sanders family, with their modest yet elegant appearance, didn't stand out in the way Lena was used to seeing first-class passengers. They didn't have the flashiness of others she'd served before, the businessmen in tailored suits, the celebrities with their entourage, the socialites who carried themselves like they owned the world. But that's what had unsettled Lena. It wasn't just about their appearance, it was something more. A quiet unease began to churn in her stomach. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she instinctively felt something was wrong. She couldn't allow herself to be wrong in these situations, especially with the level of service Sky Elite demanded from her. Lena Miller stood in the crowded gate area, watching as passengers filed past her, most of them dressed in lavish outfits and expensive accessories. The rush of first-class passengers boarding felt like a blur of faces, but then her eyes fell upon the Sanders family. They were different. Modestly dressed, with James in a navy suit that was clean but not ostentatious, and Camille in a simple yet elegant dress. Their children, well-behaved and quiet, followed behind them like any other well-mannered family. But there was something about them, something Lena couldn't quite place. It wasn't their clothing or their manners, which were polite and proper. They looked like they belonged in first class. No, their appearance was not the issue. It was an inexplicable sensation in the pit of her stomach, a feeling that this family was somehow out of place. They weren't like the usual high-flyers she was used to seeing, those who wore their wealth like a crown. Despite their valid first-class boarding passes, Lena couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something about them unsettled her deeply, though she had no concrete reason to feel this way. Her instincts kicked in, and she found herself questioning their presence in a way she would never have dared with other passengers. She had never questioned her ability to read situations before, never doubted the nature of who truly belonged in first class. As the Sanders family approached the gate, Lena found herself hesitating. She glanced at their boarding passes again, scanning the details for any inconsistencies, but there were none. Their tickets were perfect, clear, legitimate. Yet she still couldn't rid herself of the feeling that something was off. James noticed her pause, his calm, measured voice breaking through the tension. "Is there a problem?" he asked. His tone was respectful, but Lena could sense the edge of concern in his words. The unease in her gut deepened. She hesitated for a moment too long, feeling her authority as a flight attendant start to waver. She smiled as best as she could, hiding the growing discomfort within. "I'm afraid I'll need to confirm your reservation," she said, her voice even but forced. "There seems to be some confusion." Her instincts told her to dig deeper, even though every logical part of her brain knew there was no reason to. Her inner conflict made her question her own behavior. Why was she challenging them? Why did she feel the need to question their legitimacy? It was a matter she didn't fully understand, but one that seemed urgent and necessary at that moment. As the plane ascended smoothly into the sky, Camille Sanders settled into her seat, glancing at her husband, James, who was reading a book. Their children were occupied, one coloring in a travel activity book and the other gently sleeping in her mother's arms. The flight was calm, but something wasn't right. Camille had noticed the subtle shift in service as soon as the flight had begun. While the passengers seated around them were quickly attended to with drinks, snacks, and warm greetings, their row seemed to be consistently overlooked. It was a minor detail, but when it happened repeatedly, it began to feel intentional. She glanced at James, who had picked up on the same pattern. "James," she whispered, leaning in toward him, "have you noticed how slow the service is?" Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern. "It's not like the other passengers are getting any delayed service. We're being ignored." James glanced up from his book, his brow furrowing. He had noticed it too. The flight attendants had passed by their row several times, offering drinks and snacks to everyone else in first class but never acknowledging them. It wasn't just the slow service, it was the fact that they seemed to be deliberately bypassing them. "I was trying not to make a fuss," he whispered back, glancing down at their children to make sure they couldn't hear, "but I've been watching, and it's strange. They've barely even looked our way." His voice remained steady, but Camille could hear the underlying frustration. They had been on flights before, and though sometimes the service wasn't perfect, it had never been this noticeable. Every time they attempted to make eye contact with the flight attendants, they were met with a polite but forced smile before being ignored again. James sighed and leaned back in his seat. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm starting to think it's not an accident," he murmured. "They're definitely treating us differently than the other passengers." Camille nodded quietly. She wasn't angry, just deeply uncomfortable. She had experienced this kind of subtle exclusion before, but never in such a blatant setting. The question nagged at her: why were they being treated like this? What had they done to warrant this behavior? While she tried to maintain composure for the sake of their children, the unease continued to settle in her chest. She knew something wasn't right, but she wasn't sure how to confront it without causing a scene. As they exchanged glances, both Camille and James silently agreed they would endure the discomfort and get through the flight, but they would need to get answers once it was over. Rebecca Collins, with a forced smile plastered on her face, turned toward the Sanders family after scanning their boarding passes once again. Her instincts had told her something was off, and now, she was making a decision that would reaffirm her beliefs. "Follow me," Rebecca said in a crisp tone, directing them not toward the luxurious first-class section where they rightfully belonged, but toward the back of the plane. The seats near the restrooms, away from the windows with the best views and far from the comfort that first class offered. It was a calculated move, one designed to send a message that, in Rebecca's eyes, they didn't belong in the same section as her other elite passengers. James Sanders noticed the subtle shift, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Camille, who gripped their children's hands tightly. They exchanged a brief, wordless glance, both aware of the underlying tension but unwilling to make a scene. They had been discriminated against before, in more subtle ways, and while it stung, they had learned to pick their battles. But this was different. As they walked past rows of affluent passengers, some of whom glanced up in surprise, Rebecca led them down the aisle with an air of authority. The Sanders family, composed and dignified, followed without protest, though the unease in their expressions was unmistakable. It was clear that Rebecca's actions were meant to make them feel out of place, lesser than the others in the premium cabin. Settling into the back of the plane, the contrast was striking. The rest of the passengers in first class were being treated to the finest wines, polite conversation, and warm smiles. The Sanders family, however, were left to sit in their cramped row, ignored and distant from the luxury they had paid for. Their seats were in the back corner of the section, near the bathrooms, and they were now surrounded by the hum of conversation, distant from the calm ambience at the front of the cabin. James and Camille remained calm, though their frustration was palpable. They understood that Rebecca's actions weren't an accident. This was a deliberate choice, one that spoke volumes about the flight attendant's assumptions about who deserved the finest service. Camille looked out the window, her mind racing as she tried to understand why they were being treated this way. They had done nothing wrong, except perhaps stand out in Rebecca's eyes for reasons she couldn't yet understand. James squeezed her hand gently, offering her the reassurance that they would get through this, but both knew that the night's events had set something in motion that would change everything. As the flight progressed, the tension in the cabin slowly began to simmer. Rebecca Collins moved through the aisles, performing her duties mechanically, but her mind was nowhere near the task at hand. The Sanders family, now settled in the back of the plane, had continued to sit quietly, their demeanor calm despite the mistreatment they had endured. Yet something gnawed at Rebecca, an unease she couldn't shake, as though the entire situation was spiraling out of her control. By now, Rebecca had begun to feel the growing weight of her decision. The other passengers had noticed the shift in service, some whispering among themselves, casting judgment on the behavior of their flight attendant. Still, she persisted, focusing on her tasks with a sense of cold professionalism, determined to maintain the fragile control she thought she still had. But deep down, she felt the nagging suspicion that something was brewing, a storm that would soon expose her mistake. It wasn't until she was called into the cockpit that Rebecca finally realized how deep her error ran. The captain, a seasoned veteran with years of flying under his belt, looked at her with a mixture of calm concern. "Rebecca," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." His expression didn't give much away, but there was an undeniable edge in his tone. Rebecca braced herself, her heart racing. She had been expecting some sort of reprimand for her behavior. After all, she knew she hadn't been entirely fair in her treatment of the Sanders family. But what came next was far worse than anything she had anticipated. "The family you've been treating differently," Captain Harris continued, his voice steady but firm, "they're not just another set of first-class passengers. They're majority stakeholders in this airline." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Her world seemed to slow as the truth began to sink in. The Sanders family, who she had so casually dismissed as undeserving of the luxury that Skylux Airlines promised, were the very people who owned the company. They held the power. Everything she had built her career on was nothing in the face of their influence. For a long moment, Rebecca stood frozen, unable to speak. Her mind raced, desperately trying to process what she had just heard. The humiliation, the realization that her actions had been not just rude but a betrayal of the core values of the airline, weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her judgment of who was worthy of special treatment, that she hadn't seen the truth staring her in the face. The Sanders family weren't just any passengers. They were the very heart of Skylux Airlines, the people who had the power to shape the future of the company. And she had treated them as less than nothing. As she made her way back to the cabin, her legs felt unsteady. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sinking sense of dread. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo the harm she had caused. The Sanders family had seen her for who she truly was, a flight attendant who had let her biases cloud her judgment. And now, the consequences were unavoidable. As Rebecca walked back to her station, her thoughts raced. The words from Captain Harris echoed in her mind, replaying over and over again, "The Sanders family are the majority stakeholders of this airline." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and she struggled to steady herself. The confident, poised flight attendant that had always prided herself on her professionalism now felt small, exposed, and incredibly vulnerable. Her hands shook as she tried to regain control, but every step toward the galley seemed heavier than the last. Her gaze wandered toward the back of the plane, where the Sanders family sat, so quietly, so composed, and yet so wronged by her. They had not only been disrespected as passengers but had been subjected to the kind of discrimination she hadn't allowed herself to see before, at least, not so blatantly. Rebecca's breath quickened as she began connecting the dots, each of her actions now appearing more egregious in hindsight. The delay in their service, the refusal to treat them with the same respect afforded to the other first-class passengers, the decision to move them to the back of the plane, it all came flooding back. She had convinced herself that she was justified, that there was something off about them, something that didn't quite belong. She had acted on instinct, yes, but her instinct had been fueled by prejudice, and she had treated them as if they were unworthy of the luxury they had rightfully paid for. Rebecca stopped at the galley, gripping the counter for support. Her knees felt weak, and she could feel the cold sweat gathering at her brow. What have I done? She thought, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest. The Sanders family didn't deserve what had happened to them. They didn't deserve to be treated as lesser simply because Rebecca had made assumptions based on their appearance and the quiet dignity they exuded. If anything, they were the very heart of Skylux Airlines, the ones who kept the business running. They were the foundation of everything Rebecca had ever worked for, and she had undermined them without even knowing. The fear began to set in. It wasn't just about losing her job, it was about everything that came with it. Her career, her reputation, and her self-image, all of it was shattered. But it wasn't just about the professional consequences. The realization that she had acted out of unconscious bias, that she had harmed innocent people simply because of their race, was an ache deeper than anything she had ever felt. Her hands trembled as she prepared herself to face the consequences of what she had done, knowing there was no escape from the reckoning that was surely coming. As the plane made its final descent, Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest, each thud seeming louder than the hum of the engines. The weight of the truth pressed on her, and she could feel the tension in the air around her, thick and suffocating. She had known the confrontation was inevitable, but now that it was upon her, she wasn't sure how she would handle it. The moment the plane touched the tarmac, James and Camille Sanders stood up, gathering their things, their calmness betraying the storm brewing beneath the surface. They exchanged a quick glance, then turned toward Rebecca as she walked toward them, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Excuse me, Ms. Collins," James's voice was firm but measured, his eyes locking with hers. "We need to talk." Rebecca froze, and the air between them felt charged. The other passengers had begun to gather their belongings, but the Sanders family's presence commanded attention. The crew had already begun to notice, and the quiet whispers in the cabin grew louder, their curiosity piqued. Rebecca stood there, frozen for a moment, before she composed herself enough to respond. "Of course," Rebecca said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be right there." She led them to a quieter area of the plane, her stomach twisting as she walked, knowing what was coming. James and Camille exchanged a glance but didn't speak, letting Rebecca lead them. When they reached a corner, James spoke first. "Ms. Collins, I'm sure you understand that this treatment is not acceptable," he began, his voice calm but undeniably stern. "You treated us like we didn't belong in first class, like we weren't worthy of the service we paid for. And now I find out that we're the reason your airline even exists." Rebecca's heart dropped as the realization settled into her bones. She had treated them like lesser passengers, dismissing them without thought. The shame swelled within her as she met their eyes, unable to look away. I'm deeply sorry, Rebecca stammered, her voice shaking. I made a mistake. I was wrong to treat you that way. I thought you didn't belong, but I see now that I let my assumptions get in the way. I'm truly sorry. Camille's gaze didn't soften. She stood tall, her expression unwavering as she studied Rebecca. You've been in this job for 15 years, Rebecca, Camille said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. What have you learned in all that time? How could you treat people like this after all those years? Doesn't your job teach you anything about respect? Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, the words hitting her like a punch to the gut. What had she learned? Had all those years of service been reduced to nothing more than a rigid adherence to protocol, devoid of empathy? She had prided herself on her professionalism, but now, in the face of this confrontation, it felt hollow. I don't know, Rebecca admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I wasn't. And I'll never make that mistake again. Camille nodded slowly, but her eyes remained hard. Apologies don't undo the damage, Rebecca, she said. But I hope, for your sake, you truly learn from this. Rebecca stood there, a mixture of shame and regret flooding through her. She knew that this wasn't just about losing her job, it was about confronting her own biases, the ones she had ignored for so long. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, she understood that real growth only came when you truly saw the harm your actions caused and took responsibility for it. As the Sanders family walked away, Rebecca was left with her thoughts, the weight of their words lingering in the air. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was just the beginning of the hard work ahead. The days after the incident were a blur for Rebecca. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in her chest. The moments of reflection since the confrontation with James and Camille Sanders felt like a waking nightmare. She had wronged them in a way she couldn't fully comprehend at the time, and now the consequences of her actions were about to unfold. When Rebecca arrived at the Skylux Airlines headquarters, she could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The corporate building was sleek and modern, but today, it felt like a prison. She walked down the cold, sterile halls, her steps heavy with regret, her mind racing with the implications of her actions. She knew her career was in jeopardy, but the reality of it all was now hitting her in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she entered the conference room, she was greeted by Evelyn Moore, the airline's HR manager. Evelyn's no-nonsense demeanor matched the seriousness of the situation. Rebecca, Evelyn said, gesturing for her to take a seat. We're here to address your conduct on Flight 512. The incident with the Sanders family was reported, and they've filed a formal complaint. Rebecca nodded, swallowing hard. She had seen it coming, but the full force of hearing it from corporate made her stomach churn. She had hoped the matter would fade, that maybe the Sanders family would move on. But this was no ordinary family. They weren't just passengers, they were the owners of the airline. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Evelyn asked, her voice calm but firm. You allowed your biases to guide your behavior, and that's unacceptable in any professional environment, let alone here at Skylux. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had no defense. She had failed, and there was no denying it. Evelyn continued, this company prides itself on inclusivity, respect, and the highest standard of service. You violated those values and you treated the Sanders family differently. You didn't just fail them as passengers. You failed the very principles this airline stands for. Rebecca's heart sank further as she processed the weight of Evelyn's words. This wasn't just about a single incident. It was about the years of her own biases, the ones she had ignored, the ones she had been blind to. She had prided herself on professionalism, but now she saw how her own prejudices had clouded her judgment and how that had hurt others. "We're holding you accountable for your actions," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "This will serve as a lesson, not just for you, but for the entire company. It's a teachable moment. We'll be providing you with training on unconscious bias, and we expect you to reflect on your actions and make the necessary changes." Rebecca nodded slowly, the weight of it all finally sinking in. She wasn't sure what the future held for her, but she understood now that this was more than just losing her job. It was about confronting her past mistakes and doing the hard work of becoming a better person, both professionally and personally. She had been given a chance to grow. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. As she left the conference room, Rebecca knew the road ahead would be long, filled with uncomfortable reflections and difficult conversations. But for the first time, she was ready to face them. She could no longer ignore her biases or pretend that her actions hadn't mattered. She would learn, and she would change. The journey had just begun. Months had passed since the incident with the Sanders family, and Rebecca had started a new chapter in her life. The road to redemption wasn't easy, but it had been necessary. She had taken the lessons from Skylux Airlines to heart and was determined to prove that she could be better, not just for herself, but for others as well. She had spent the months following the corporate review reflecting on her biases, attending sensitivity training, and reworking the way she viewed the world around her. It wasn't just about getting her job back. It was about making sure that the mistakes she had made in the past didn't define her forever. With that in mind, Rebecca took an unexpected step. She began volunteering with a local nonprofit focused on promoting workplace diversity and inclusion. It was a way for her to put the lessons she had learned into practice and contribute to something bigger than herself. Through the nonprofit, Rebecca began to develop training programs aimed at teaching employees how to recognize and combat unconscious bias in their workplaces. It wasn't just theory. Rebecca worked to create practical, hands-on experiences where employees could see firsthand the impact of their biases and how to correct them. She wasn't just speaking about change, she was actively contributing to it. At first, Rebecca was unsure how her efforts would be received. She had never worked outside of the airline industry, and she wondered if people would question her sincerity, given her past actions. But as she began working more closely with her team, she realized that her genuine desire to change spoke for itself. She became involved in organizing workshops and even began speaking at conferences about her experiences. Her journey, she realized, could serve as an example for others, showing them that even those who make mistakes can change if they're willing to do the hard work. As she walked into a workshop one morning, Rebecca noticed the participants were more engaged than ever. She had earned their trust, and with that trust, she could continue to help reshape how organizations dealt with bias and inequality. The work wasn't easy, and there were days when she doubted herself, but Rebecca knew she was on the right path. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly proud of the person she was becoming. This wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a significant step forward. Rebecca had proven, through her actions and dedication, that she was committed to change. She wasn't just learning from her past mistakes, she was actively making the world a better place for others. And that, she knew, was what truly mattered.